The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So hello everybody, and very warm welcome to the webinar series organized by the EvalPartners Equity Focused and Gender Responsive Evaluation Task Force. So this is the second seminar of the webinar series organized by our task force, and we are very pleased to have with us Professor Donna Mertens, who will give a talk on enabling factors and preconditions for gender responsive and equity focused evaluations. So I'm Inga Shnukaite and Murray Saunders. So we are the co-chairs of the task force, and we are very excited about this webinar and of course a very large number of participants connecting to us today. So what is EvalPartners? For those who don't know about us yet, so it is an international collaborative initiative with 34 key partners and others still joining to build national evaluation capacities. Currently it is led by the International Organization for Cooperation in Evaluation and UN Women. The objective of initiative is to enable the capacities of civil society organizations to engage in strategic and meaningful manner in national evaluation processes, contributing to improved country-level evaluation systems that are equity-focused and gender-responsive. The Task Force on Equity-Focused and Gender-Responsive Evaluation was created to integrate the gender perspective and the equity perspective in the key objectives of EvalPartners, which is enabling environment, institutional capacity building, and individual capacity building of evaluation associations, societies, and networks. So one of the objectives of the task force, what we're doing here today, is to promote gender and equity-focused responsive evaluation approach. Other priorities of the task force for this year are implementation of the 2 innovation challenges, what were recently announced by EvalPartners for engendering the International Year for Evaluation, so as well as projects to integrate the application, apply gender perspective in the national evaluation policies in selected countries. So if you have questions about the task force, or you would like to join the task force, so please free to contact me and my co-chair, Professor Murray Saunders. So this is very briefly about the task force. But now on the organizational matters of this webinar. So the webinar will take for 1 hour. So during this hour, online participants, you are very encouraged to put the questions in the chat box so that you can find on the right-hand side of your screen. And then my colleague Isabel Suarez, so she will help us to moderate the questions or to pick up the key questions that Donna will answer. So now I would like to give a floor to Professor Murray Saunders to introduce our presenter for today.
Great. Thanks very much, Inga. As Inga was saying, one of the most important recent developments has been the focus on gender and equity within EvalPartners. But of course, some people have been concerned with these sorts of issues for a long time. It's not new, but they might have been fighting a lone battle to some extent. So there are practitioners and thinkers who have been working in this area, and that brings me directly to welcome Donna to our webinar, and she epitomizes this kind of person, somebody who's been championing these sorts of issues for some, I won't say many years, that would be ungallant, but enough time to make a very significant contribution. Now, Inga said a little bit about what Donna will be focusing on in her presentation, so I won't go into that. I'll allow Donna to set the scene herself, but it is within this interest in the enabling environment. How do we create circumstances in which a focus on equity and gender can be enhanced and enriched and sustained? And she's going to talk a little bit about that. And I think in particular connecting with the array of stakeholders that might be involved. Now, I just want to say a little bit more about the personal connection that, intriguingly, I say, that Donna and I have had. We first met, and we also started to work with each other some 14 years ago, and that was in the formation stage of the IOCE, the International Organization for Cooperation in Evaluation. We were part of the group charged with developing and planning for the inaugural meeting of the IOCE, and we went to exotic places and did a lot of talking and I suppose the odd glass of wine. And during that process, we were able, with lots of very committed colleagues, to initiate the IOCE. So from a personal point of view, it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Donna. But I'd say, just to finish, that her influences are wide-ranging and substantial. But I do want to just identify a couple of things that I, in particular, have enjoyed in terms of the contribution she's made. The first is on the mixed methodology and thinking about the way in which we can be quite, in inverted commas, Catholic about our approaches to these things. But more importantly, it's not just methodologies on their own, but the connection between the choice of methodologies and the endpoints. What sort of evaluations are we doing? So the connection between methodologies and social justice have always been central to her work. The second thing I'd like to just mention before I hand over to Donna is the large contribution she's made around transformative evaluation and thinking through what that might mean. And again, that is focusing in particular about the way we do evaluations and how the way we do them in terms of being responsive to community needs, being inclusive as possible, identifying focus and questions which are appropriate and actually mean something to communities and so on. Those sorts of approaches, I think, have really made a very important mark. So, for those kinds of reasons, then we've got actually absolutely the best person to lead this webinar. So, if your head is still not split, Donna, I'd like now to hand over to Donna to lead the webinar. So, your floor is
okay, thank you very much, Murray and Inga. I appreciate very much the introduction as well as setting the context for this webinar. And I want to say that even though I was perhaps one of the pioneers in terms of bringing the issues of social justice to evaluation, I was never alone, because there's always been a very large community of people who haven't had their voices necessarily in the mainstream, who have been clamoring for this kind of evolution in the world of evaluation so that they could see the work being done as something that would result in an improvement in social justice. So I've always been surrounded by communities of people who experience discrimination and don't have access to their rights in the fullness that is expected. And so I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased to do this presentation. I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint slides and give you an overview first and then jump into the topic. So at this point, you should be seeing my PowerPoint slides. And as was mentioned, the Enabling Gender Responsive and Equity Focused Evaluation is the topic. And what I want to do is to explore very briefly the meaning of those terms, and then to talk about strategies. That's the important part about enabling, and also the concept of sustainability. And I'm going to do that by first looking at the meaning of the terms, then focusing in on dimensions of diversity within communities that I believe is the key to being responsive and to addressing issues of equity. And then I'm going to share some experiences I've had recently in working with the combination of transformative evaluation and resilience theory, and also leave you with some resources that you can continue to pursue. Now, I'm not seeing my slides change, so I'm not sure what I have to do to make the slide change. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So just to talk about the meaning of these, I went, of course, to the source, to UN Women about gender responsive evaluation, and that what we're looking at is still what we expect in an evaluation, that it will be systematic and it will be impartial. It will provide credible and reliable evidence, and that but here's where it comes in with the gender responsive equity focus, is that it's being done to further the achievement or figure out the reasons why we're not making progress towards the intended results on gender equity and the empowerment of women. If we take that then to a broader concept of equity-focused evaluation, then we're talking about the judgment of effectiveness, efficiency, impact, sustainability, coverage, connectedness, and coherence, which is what we would expect from an evaluation. But when we add the equity focus, then we're talking about policies, programs, and projects with equitable development results for the worst off groups. And so our evaluations need to be conducted in ways that we know who those worst off groups are, and that we develop methodologies that allow us to come to an understanding of their experiences. And so I was also exploring the UN evaluation group's discussion of gender and equity-focused evaluation, in which they describe the need to contribute to social and economic change process that is at the heart of most development programs by, and here's the gender and equity focus, identifying and analyzing the inequalities, discriminatory practices, and unjust power relations that are central to development problems. So it's asking us as evaluators to be conscious of the inequities, the discrimination, and power relations that are embedded in the development context in which we work. I also mentioned that I wanted to tie these concepts to sustainability. And so looking at sustainability in the generic sense, it's the likelihood of a continuation of benefits from a development intervention after the intervention is completed, or the probability of continued long-term benefits. And so that would lead us, with a gender equity focus, gender responsiveness and equity focus, to ask questions about the program support in terms of national and local women's organizations or other advocacy organizations, disability organizations, sexual minority organizations, deaf organizations, and do these organizations demonstrate leadership commitment and technical capability to continue to work with the program or advocate for change. So you see how our evaluation questions become not just how will the benefits continue after the intervention, but to what extent have we engaged appropriately with organizations that can have a role in that sustainability, and to what extent have we contributed to the capacity building of leadership and technical capacity so that the programs can continue to advocate for change. So I wanted, now that we have the groundwork set, to talk about enabling and sustaining gender-responsive and equity-focused evaluations. And my proposition to you is that we should use a transformative lens in the evaluation itself, meaning that our evaluation is focused on what we need to figure out in order to leave people who were in the worst off conditions in positions that recognize their strengths and that have appropriately situated them to continue to work towards their rights. And so one of the things that I mentioned earlier, and Murray mentioned it, that we're looking at the emphasis on the full range of stakeholder involvement. So it's not saying you only work with members of the marginalized communities, but because they have been systematically excluded for a variety of reasons, we give a lot of attention to how we can reach people who are marginalized, what's necessary in order to do that appropriately with cultural respect. And we also, of course, want to include program personnel, women's and advocacy organizations, the national evaluation systems, and donors. One of the examples I'm going to share with you that I mentioned earlier is some work I'm doing in 5 South Asian countries on the use of a resilience lens with a transformative mixed methods evaluation approach. And what I'm calling for is the role of the evaluator to become one of advocacy for transformation, for appropriate inclusion, for the recognition of strengths in the community. And so when we talk about a transformative framework, I'm going to focus now on cultural and linguistic diversity, meaning that the evaluator proactively addresses issues like reciprocity. How is reciprocity built into the evaluation? Are we positioning ourselves to give back to communities data, skills, capacity that they can use in terms of advocacy for themselves? And are we positioning the evaluation in ways that we engage appropriately with the range of organizations, stakeholders, advocates, so that the program can sustain? And how can the evaluation contribute to the possibility of taking action to enhance social justice and human rights after the evaluator leaves the community, not in a broad generic sense, but with conscious inclusion of diversity, so that we are addressing cultural, linguistic, economic, gender, disability, religion, tribal affiliation, immigration status, refugee status, the many dimensions of diversity that we encounter in our evaluation work. How do we consciously include those in ways that enhance the action can be taken towards social justice? If we go back to the UN and their evaluation group, they raise questions about who to involve: the beneficiaries, the implementers, rights holders, duty bearers. And as an evaluator, we want to think about, well, how much effort is required in order to do an evaluation that is inclusive? How should we spend our time? What kind of budget implications does this have? Also asking questions, particularly in terms of cultural norms. If we have a range of stakeholders to be included, how should we do that? Is it appropriate to have all people come together? Is it more appropriate to have separate groups? We need to think about the safety, fairness, cultural differences, the avoidance of bias, accommodations that might be necessary. Will we need sign language interpreters? Will we need other types of linguistic interpreters? Will we need physical accommodations for people who have physical disabilities? Will there need to be support provided because people are leaving their homes? They need to have transportation, food, childcare. What is it that has to be done in order to really engage with people? And then asking ourselves questions about the level of participation. Clearly, we can't spend every minute of our evaluation time in meetings with stakeholders, but we do need to sort out at what level should the participation occur, when in the process, what kind of challenges can we anticipate, how do we overcome those challenges, so that in the end we don't say, well, we meant to include people from this region, but we found that we didn't have the time to do it, or there wasn't a willingness on their part to come. When we say there's not a willingness to come, can we critically interrogate that and say, how were the invitations issued? Who issued them? Was there a question of trust that needed to be overcome? Is there clarity of communication? And how do we establish our own credibility with the stakeholder groups? Because what we want in the end is for the stakeholders to embrace the results, And it's through this chain of events of appropriately identifying, including, supporting stakeholders that we build the relationships necessary for those stakeholders to see the results as credible and move forward with the results even when we depart. So looking at successful strategies that are possible to use in this kind of context, a resilience-focused, community-based involvement. I plan to give you some examples of work I'm doing in South Asia now related to that, creating and developing the awareness of what are the relevant dimensions of diversity within the context in which we work, establishing specific goals of our evaluation that include social transformation, addressing the issue of the formation of relationships, and acknowledgement of power differences. So let's look at some strategies. What you see before you now is a set of characteristics for a study that I did on court access, and this was done with the deaf and hard of hearing population in the United States. But what I show you here is the multiplicity of ways people can be different within the deaf and hard of hearing communities. If you were unaware of the diversity, you might just think, well, there's deaf people and then there's people who can use hearing aids. But what we have are deaf people who use American Sign Language, who might be highly educated, who might be quite literate and able to engage in high-level discussions with appropriate American Sign Language interpreting. We could also have people who have American Sign Language but much more limited education. And in that way we need to accommodate by any kind of print materials that we use, and also in being aware of whether people are understanding what the instructions are and how we want to engage with them. You also have people who don't have American Sign as a language, but they use gestures or pantomimes. They may have some very limited signing. They may be very low in literacy, in which case what we normally do is to have an American Sign Language interpreter who is being watched by a deaf interpreter who then gestures and pantomimes what's being said. And this is an accommodation that's necessary for this particular group of people. We also could have deaf-blind people, in which case we would need to have an interpreter who signs into the hands of the deaf-blind person, and that way they feel the signs. We have hard-of-hearing people who use assistive listening devices like cochlear implants or hearing aids. We have oral deaf adults who rely on speech and lip reading. And every country has its own sign language, oftentimes more than one. In the United States, we have a large population who uses Mexican Sign Language. So all of these dimensions of diversity are important for us to know, because otherwise we can't really know what the issues are within that context, and we can't support and engage with members of the community who have these diverse characteristics. And how do I know about this? Well, partly because I've worked in the deaf community for over 30 years, but also because we had an advisory board who was made up of members of the deaf and hard of hearing communities, as well as the judicial communities, to find out what kind of people they encountered in the court system who were either deaf or hard of hearing. What kind of accommodations would be necessary? So I want to share that with you because it's an experience of my own, that I came to understand the diversity through my own experience, also through my relationships in that community, and through the work with an advisory board. I wanted also to share with you another set of dimensions of diversity from India that you can see on your screen. Women, Dalit, Adivasi, elected Panchayat Raj, religious minorities, and I apologize for my pronunciation. I am not really familiar and acquainted with all of these subgroups, but Chaluda Solomon, who's a person I've worked with in India, is the person who has the cultural understanding of the communities that he's working with, and he's done this by working closely with members of the community to find out who are the power brokers, who are those who are marginalized, what are the context and language issues and so forth, cultural issues, so that he can appropriately engage with this diverse set of people. And so I share this with you just as another example that, demonstrates that I don't really know this cultural context the way Solomon does, but it's up to us as evaluators when we work in a community to find out what those dimensions of diversity are and how we can appropriately support them. So these are questions I'd like you to consider. What dimensions of diversity are relevant in your evaluation context? How would you know? How would you invite people to participate? And how would you support them in culturally appropriate ways? Now, other questions that arise of a more epistemological nature within gender-responsive and equity-focused evaluation include how can you, as an evaluator, come to recognize differences in power for different stakeholder groups? And how can you challenge systems that support the privileged few in positions of power? How can you bring the views of the less privileged into the evaluation in culturally appropriate ways? And so these are questions that I think all of us have to give consideration to in the evaluations that we do. A few of the inclusion strategies that I have found to be very useful, starting from the community, finding out who are the spokespersons, who has power in the community, who doesn't. Are there organizations that need to be included? Who are they? How do you contact them? What's considered culturally appropriate? The use of advisory boards, and sometimes more than one is necessary, depending on the culture and the context in which you're working. Beginning understandings from the vantage point of the least privileged, meaning that we don't come in with assumptions that we know exactly what the program should look like and do, but what is it from the least privileged that we can learn that then leads us to a program that is addressing their needs in ways that they feel is appropriate. How do we work with an awareness of the diversity in the community? We develop strategies for that. We develop strategies for respectful support. And in my work, I recommend the use of a cyclical approach to data collection and use, meaning that we try to collect data early on to get an idea of the context, and then we use that information in terms of the development of the intervention, and we use that understanding to continue to do process or performance-based evaluation. And when we look at impact, we do so with the eye back to what were we given information about early on, and were we able to be responsive to the needs of that community. Now I wanted to share with you this framework that I've been working with it's the resilience approach, and this is work that is based from work with the World Bank and their resilience approach framework, in which we're working within conflict zones and areas where there is adversity. And so what you see is, yes, we look first for resilience components. What's the resilience? What are the adversities that students face in these kinds of contexts? How does the education system address risks in the schools? What are the assets? So you see again this emphasis, skills, competence, and being accountable. The socio-emotional well-being, being engagement with others, is very important. The relevant school and community supports in terms of access, permanence, teaching, learning, and school and community partnerships, and aligned with the education system support. So that brings us down to the idea of the delivery of services in ways that truly works for the resilience, strengthening the resilience within communities that face adversity and conflict. So we took this framework and we asked members of a working group in South Asia to identify both qualitative and quantitative data tools that they could use throughout the collection of data related to resilience and adversity, what criteria they would use for good quality data, And we presented them with several tools, which I'm going to share with you, and resources for those for use with rapid data collection and in less literate contexts. So the notion of universal design, that however you do the evaluation, you do it so that it is accessible to everyone. And universal design is something that has been developing and flourishing in the evaluation world. We're seeing more and more access to tools that help us to test whether or not what we're doing in terms of data collection is really accessible to the communities we work with. Also looking at the international development community practices and tools, the World Bank has a participatory process for evaluation, rapid data collection, particularly with a focus in less literate contexts. The tools that I was working with in Southeast Asia were the rapid assessment tool, resilience approach, the context and needs analysis, and this involves engagement with members of communities at different levels. Also, there's a tool that you can look at the policy and analyze the policy within the country to see how it is either supporting resilience or not. And then there's a third tool, policy school application assessment, is used at the school level to determine the school's ability to support resilience and address adversity. There are other existing instruments that you can use to build a resilience approach. There's one that was developed by Michael Unger and Linda Liebenberg that looks at individual, parent, and context assets and opportunities. There's risk surveys and vulnerability scales, assets and strength surveys and scales, policy assessment and impact evaluation tools, and participatory process tools. I'm going to give you a website where you can find these materials so that you can look at them and see how appropriate they are to the context in which you work. So in terms of resilience in evaluation, we begin with contextual analysis. We think about who needs to be involved and how. The use of the RES 360 is the instrument that we recommend use to identify challenges and assets in fragile and conflict communities, and it involves the community in data gathering and culturally responsive ways. The projects that I'm working with now in South Asia include one in Nepal that looks at the learning processes for vulnerable displaced children living in urban slum areas. In Bhutan, looking at access to school in vulnerable remote rural communities. In Afghanistan, increasing access for girls and women in higher education. In Lebanon, looking at the influence of supportive peer interactions for Syrian refugees, the Syrian refugees who are now living in Lebanon. And in India, exploring education related to resilience processes for gender minorities. The members of these teams are all using a transformative mixed methods approach to evaluation with a resilience theoretical lens to address these dimensions of diversity with an effort towards improving the life experiences for these marginalized communities. So I leave you with this particular resource, the RES Research Training Module. It's open to be used by anyone. It consists of a manual and handouts, PowerPoints, and guidance materials. And if you're interested, you can go to this website and you'll find the contact information as well as the resources. I'm also going to leave you with this Gender Equality and Women's Rights Responsive Evaluation statement from UN Women about how you can assess your own evaluation in terms of its relevance to international normative frameworks for gender equality and women's rights. Do you analyze and address the structures that contribute to inequalities for women, men, girls, boys, and other dimensions of diversity? Do you maximize participation and inclusion of rights holders and duty bearers throughout the process of the evaluation? Do you seek opportunities to build sustainable results through empowerment and capacity building? And do you contribute to short, medium, and long-term objectives through an examination of results change, processes, contextual factors, and causality using gender and rights analysis? There are many resources that are available, and I've provided you with a list here that comes from EvalPartners, from UN Women, from the UN Evaluation Group, and other gender equity and gender equality and human rights evaluation reports. I'm providing you also with some of the references that I used to create this presentation for you. And I know that we're going to have a period of time for questions. I'm just wrapping up here. And the questions that for this particular presentation you should send to Isabel Suarez or after the presentation. I know right now you can enter them in the chat room in the GoToMeeting. But if you don't get your question answered and you didn't have a chance to ask it after the presentation, you can write to Isabel Suarez and you can get her, she will convey the questions to me. I've also provided you with my contact information. My understanding is that this PowerPoint will be posted after the presentation is over, so you'll be able to use the live links in it to explore the resources.